Dear friends, colleagues, a very warm welcome here this afternoon to our session, which is part of the Stockholm Peacebuilding and Development Forum this year, the second year that it's gone virtual. How I wish that we could all sit in a room together, and how grateful I am that we can at least meet here in this space to start a conversation that has been going on in our rooms, in our contexts for quite a while now, and that I think it is high time to make public. Welcome to our colleagues who are joining us. A very warm welcome to the session. I am Beatrix Austin. I am your moderator today. I head the Conflict Transformation Research Department at the Berlin-based Berghof Foundation. Our organization celebrates its 50th anniversary this year, as you can see over my shoulder. 50 years of peace education, of conflict transformation research, and of peace support, specializing in creating spaces for dialogue. And we work like our partner organization who helped us to put this conversation together, the Life and Peace Institute, both internationally, but also abroad, and have so over the course of our existence, although much less visible to our international colleagues. We co-host the session with Life and Peace Institute. Jenny Svanberg, thank you very much. An international and ecumenical center based in Sweden, supporting and promoting non-violent approaches to conflict transformation. You too combine research and action, and you place a particular emphasis on strengthening local capacities and on enhancing conditions for building peace. A very warm welcome to our panelists who are joining this pathfinding or path-seeking conversation, to Michelle, to Daniil, to Jenny, and to Ibital, who join us from across the globe, another wonderful advantage of these virtual formats. I will introduce them with slightly more detail as I speak to them shortly, and will also post their a bit more background on them in the chat as we go, so you know a bit more about where they're coming from. But I won't go through all of their impressive bios here, so that we have time to actually focus on talking about our subject. The technical announcements you saw as you were coming in, but the most important ones I also want to remind you of here again. Please keep your microphone off unless you are speaking. The chat is open for you to pose any comments or questions. And if you would like to join the conversation later on, please do raise your hand so that I can see you. If you're experiencing any difficulties with the sound or the image, consider turning your camera off while we're still sort of speaking amongst sort of the round table here on your screen, and turn it on when you're coming into the conversation. You can comment and ask in the chat. You can also chat to each other in case you find a colleague that you wanted to connect up to again after many months or many years. Feel free to reach out. If you have any technical difficulties, you can reach the technical moderator through the chat as well. Do feel free to reach out to them. Our conversation here today explores the importance of engaging in peace building, not just in far-flung, far-away theaters of war and conflict, but in Western European societies. And we want to discuss what approaches there are already that are used to build peace at home. And we are aware that that has a space of resonance that is interesting to unpack. Not all of these bits that are done to build peace at home might be labeled as such. Over the course of the year and a bit that we've lived through this pandemic, seeing lots of movements in different parts of the globe, not least the Black Lives Matter movement, they have exacerbated long-standing tensions. And across Europe, we have come to ask new old questions relating to governance, to rule of law, to inclusion and exclusion. And these cast doubt on the substance and sustainability of peace in Europe's heartland, and they make peace building an explicit need here. So we hope that you're as curious as we are to see what is there and what could be there, what should be there. That's what today's discussion centers around. Before we get started, we're also curious about you, of course. And we would like to ask you, first of all, where geographically constitutes at home for you. My colleague is posting a link in the chat that allows you to access a Mentimeter. Enter a country, a region, and let us see where at home is for you. So you can simply click on the link. You should go directly to the site where you can enter it. And now we'll see where we are. So this cloud tells us interesting. Lovely. So the word cloud does tell us that most of you here join us from home, where we actually want to focus our attention, namely Europe. Quite a big UK contingent, even though I can't tell from the word clouds how many of you those are. Quite a lot of people who connect to very different places, geographies, mountains, where the children are. And I love that as well, but also some that are coming from faraway places. So this is a lovely combination, I think, and a key audience for us to think about what we want to think about. Next, before I start opening the conversation, we want to ask you how important you would say it is to apply peace building in Western European countries. There is going to be a poll which allows you to rate between 1, as in not very important, to 5, as in very important. And you should see it now on your screens. There is, of course, likely going to be a little selection bias, given the topic of our session. But from this, we would glean, I'll just let it run its course, it's still being processed. Yeah. And from this, it seems that you join us here because you think, like we do, that it is actually a very, very important question. One that that is in urgent need of some creative ideas. And with that, I would like to turn to the core piece of our session today, which is a chat with 4 very experienced and creative peace builders in very different realms, who are going to help us work through what it might mean to bring peace building home and to build and sustain peace in Western Europe. Michelle Parlefleet, I turn to you first because you've been a bit of a, forgive me as I just try to free my screen so that I can see Michelle again. There we go. Now I can. Michel Parlevliet, you've been a bit of an inspiration for us also for this panel, because you have approached several of us with sort of really saying sort of, this is something that I think we need to speak about and we need to talk about. I'd like to ask you, how did this question of peace building at home first arise for you? How long has it been accompanying you? And maybe what observations do you make in your own home setting that make it a really important question for you? Michel, you're an independent peace-building practitioner, but you're also experienced in lots of fields, from academia to NGO practice. So I think your answer is going to be manifold.
Thanks, Bea, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm really excited to see so many of you have signed up and tuned into our session today. And I appreciate the Stockholm Forum for Peace and Development giving us space to organize this session. Well, actually, the question has been traveling with me for the better part of the past 10 years. In 2010, I returned back home to Western Europe in the Netherlands, where I'm from, after living and working abroad for about 15 years. And by then, I'd lived and worked for shorter, longer stretches of time in especially South Africa, Nepal, and Aceh, and also worked in Zimbabwe. And on my return to the Netherlands, I realized I was feeling quite alienated. Of course, I myself had changed, but it also seemed to me that my home context had changed quite a bit. In the Netherlands, there had been 2 political murders while I had been away. The political climate had significantly hardened. Populism was on the rise. Multiculturalism had become a dirty word, and integration had supposedly failed. Islamophobic rhetoric was common in the public domain, and income inequality was growing. And having worked on issues of peace and conflict and human rights and social justice for years elsewhere in the world, it seemed to me that my home context, both in terms of my country of origin and Western Europe more generally, was far less peaceful and stable than it had been before, with a rise in divisive narratives, growing levels of inequality, and a reduced faith in institutions, both at the national level, but also at the European level. And other developments also made me sit up and take notice. There were riots in London in 2011. There were violent clashes in the Netherlands around the Black Pete tradition. There were terrorist attacks on the continent, of course, 2005 in London. There was the unrest in the French banlieues and later the Bataclan attack. There was the attack in Utøya in Sweden. There was unrest and a kind of escalation around the referendum in Catalonia in Spain, polarization around Brexit. And all of this made me increasingly reflect on how peace building is understood and applied, and what it means to be a peace builder. And I got more and more frustrated with the way in which peace building seemed to be mostly construed and applied as something that's relevant elsewhere, in kind of far-flung, like you put it, Bea, conflict-affected contexts, which are always understood in a fairly stereotypical way, settings where large-scale physical violence has taken place, and often in the global south. Which made me think, how do we construct or how do we construe conflict and peace, and where do we think peace building is needed? And how come that so many Europe-based and US-based organizations keep focusing on peace building abroad, while paying very little attention to issues of exclusion, inequality, injustice, and insecurity in their own context? Certainly in theory, peace building is concerned with manifest conflict and with latent conflict, but it seemed that there was a bit of a blind spot when it came to conflict dynamics in the global north and the relevance of peace building within Europe. And all of this made me increasingly convinced of talking about and applying peace building in my home context. And for me, this wasn't only a matter of securing and sustaining peace in my home context, but it also had to do with the legitimacy and credibility of peace building as a practice and as a field. How can we do peace building far out if we turn a blind eye to what's happening here? So things have shifted a bit in the last 2 years, but let me leave it at that before I take up too much space.
Thank you so much, Michel. Now, I wonder if I wonder what sort of has helped you coin that phrase, bringing peace building home. And I imagine that for some, that might be a little bit provocative or a little bit at least tricky, as though you were suggesting that it's something that was created here and then exported for the benefit of others, and now it's being brought home. What makes you use that term?
Thanks, Bea. It's really good that you asked the question. And it's good to have the opportunity to clarify the phrase, because it has raised at times a few eyebrows. So let me first explain why I use this phrase and where it comes from, and then explain or comment on the raised eyebrows. First, I kind of use it in an everyday colloquial manner, like I met a friend in town and now I'm bringing him or her home for dinner. Like I worked with peace building abroad and now I'm bringing it home to my own context, which doesn't necessarily imply that it comes from this context. And actually, I've also, as an alternative, spoken about peace building in my backyard as a kind of play on the not in my backyard phrase that also comes up at times. But my use of the at home phrase or bringing home also comes from a range of social legal studies on the mobilization and implementation of human rights in consolidated democracies like the US, the UK, and the Netherlands. And this is often referred to as a process of bringing human rights home. And that phrase stems from a speech by Eleanor Roosevelt at the 10th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where she said that human rights acquire meaning in small places close to home, that human rights only really start to be alive for people if they matter in their own communities, in their school environment, in their work environment, and in their communities. And interestingly, these studies of implementing human rights in the context of the US or the UK or the Netherlands have often noted that human rights have very often been perceived as an instrument or an issue of foreign policy, as indeed an export product, something that we do elsewhere, but don't necessarily use as a frame to analyze social and political issues in the domestic context. And it seemed to me that this tendency to emphasize rights for others had a parallel in peace building, where we tend to focus on peace building for others rather than how it relates to ourselves. And then finally, my use of this at home notion also links to what's been called the local turn in peace building. So this emphasis that's arisen in peace building policy and literature on localizing peace building, on making sure that local people in conflict affected context own and drive processes to intervene in conflict and build peace. And it seemed to me that if people that support peace building, even if they come from the North, are so serious about localizing peace building, then let's also consider the local in their own context. And that's not to say, again, that peace building comes from the North. But of course, that has been raised. Do I imply that peace building originates from the North? And I definitely don't think so. I'm well aware. And in fact, my own learning, a lot of my professional or practical learning has in fact come from working alongside colleagues in South Africa or in Zimbabwe or in Nepal. And that expertise is built up in the kind of global peace building expertise that exists. But if the at-home phrase is a little awkward, I also think that awkwardness serves a function in and of itself, because it provides a basis for questioning for how come that so much kind of peace building is kind of done by institutions based in the North but applied elsewhere, or that so much funding for peace building comes from the North but again is spent elsewhere without paying attention to the home environment. So the fact that the at-home phraseology might be a little awkward or a little provocative, I think can actually be useful in kind of raising questions of power that exist in the peace building field and that we're not necessarily so explicit about, but that need to be discussed.
Thank you, Michelle. Before turning to you, Jenny, and your experience at Life and Peace, Michelle, I'd like to highlight very briefly, maybe, or ask you to highlight two things for us. Maybe what was one of the most surprising responses you got to starting discussing bringing peace building home? And also, what would you say is one of the most important merits of doing it? You highlighted one, which I think, especially also in the context of the ever more important discussions around decolonizing peace building or decolonizing conflict transformation, and unpacking some of the practices of a well-intentioned but also fraught with structural and historical power inequalities and historical injustices field. I think that to me would be sort of one merit that I'd already noted down. But just briefly, those two, sort of one of the most surprising responses and one merit that you really, really see in taking this conversation further.
Okay, that I'll do a bit quicker to also make sure that we have enough time for colleagues. The responses have actually really changed, but what I found quite interesting initially, say when I raised this in 2015 or 2017, the responses were generally quite skeptical and quite dismissive. Come on, are you serious? Oh, but are you saying that we're as bad as Afghanistan or Iraq or Mali or South Sudan? Which I thought was very interesting, as if peace building only applies to situations of full-scale civil war, for example, which for me is really, so it kind of really raises questions around how do we construe conflict? How do we construe peace? And a second response I often got was, well, yeah, interesting, but there's no money in this. I mean, we wouldn't be able to support this because most of the funding for peace building comes from development aid, which is indeed a structural constraint, but that in itself doesn't kind of negate the relevance in my respect. Fortunately, in the last 2 years, and I think it has a lot to do with the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic, that has really changed, and the kind of polarization we've seen in the UK and the US, where peace builders have increasingly recognized this is a discussion to be had in their own context. And that perhaps for me is one of the important merits that peace building brings, or bringing peace building up in the context of, say, Western Europe, that it kind of opens up a space for discussing what do we mean by peace and what's necessary to sustain peace in this context. And the peace that we have, does it work in the same way for all people in society? Because I think there are patterns of inclusion and exclusion in society that we're not necessarily sufficiently explicit about and that do need to be addressed. So that on an abstract level, and on a practical level, I think there's a lot of kind of insights and methodologies from peace building that may be relevant. Dealing with the past, for example, is relevant in my own home context of the Netherlands in terms of dealing with the colonial legacy. Then there are issues around conflict sensitivity. What does that mean when allocating resources around COVID support, etc.? Peace committees, conflict analysis. I think there's lots both on a kind of more generic level that peace building can bring, but also on a very kind of practical, methodological, process-oriented domain.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Jenny, you're a senior advisor at Life and Peace Institute. And I want to ask you, because you are one European organization that is not just working abroad, but that also has a programming at home. How and why did LPI decide to do that? And what have been the responses or the experience with your work in Sweden?
Thank you for that question, Beatrice. So Life and Peace Institute, or LPI, we have been working with peace building in the Horn of Africa since the late 1980s. And we're an international peace building organization that works in partnership with civil society. And we were founded in Sweden, and our head office is in Uppsala, a bit north of Stockholm. And I think there were some different things that influenced us to embark on this journey to work with peace building within Sweden. On a global policy level, we had the new universal global agenda, such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, coming in 2015. and the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace and security that really provided the mandate also to work in countries such as Sweden. But mainly, our journey was very much influenced by the realities we were seeing in Sweden. And in 2015, Sweden, similar to many countries, received an extraordinary influx of refugees. And followed this, we could really see a hardened rhetoric, more restrictive immigration policies, and a polarized public discourse on immigration and increasing polarization in Sweden. So I think this is when kind of the thought started to brew among our staff, and seeing these problems at home, and that we really can't ignore it. And actually that we do have tools and methods from our long experience working with peace building in the Horn of Africa that we think actually can be useful here. But I think it's important to point out also that our wish to engage with peace building in Sweden, it goes beyond the debate on migration. We have seen examples of polarization among different groups in Sweden. And for example, minority groups such as the Sami and the Roma, they bear witness of everyday racism and threats in Sweden. And some of these issues are more structural and have been present in Sweden to a different degree for a long time. So I think with all this, we started small back in 2018, and our main project so far, Peace Finders, has been engaging youth around the global goals such as SDG 16 and the UN Security Council Resolution, Youth, Peace and Security. And when you asked about the responses so far, well, I think maybe mirroring Michelle a bit also, they have been quite from one side to another. I think on the one hand, I've got some very surprised reactions, both from outside Sweden as within Sweden. What? Working with peace building in Sweden, but you're the most peaceful country in the whole world. Why on earth would you do that? But on the other hand, I think we also have received a lot of positive responses from people being in Sweden and saying this is really much needed. So it's really great that you're starting to work on this. So I think that's...
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. You said sort of you did, I mean, many decades of work in the Horn of Africa. How and did you have to adapt your tools, your methodologies when you started working in Sweden?
Yes, thank you for that question. And it's really wonderful so that we have this toolbox of approaches that we have been using in the Horn of Africa. And for example, sustained dialogue, which is an approach that we have been using for more than 10 years in countries such as Ethiopia, with colleagues such as Gibraltar working with this. So you'll hear more about it. And we have started to test and translate it and adapt it to the Swedish settings. And I think we do need to contextualize it a bit, but very much of it is useful as it is. And we have also received positive feedback from others that they see this as useful. And this year we are working with an approach of participatory action research, where we are working with a number of youth acting as researchers in their own communities and asking questions about what is peace to you, and do you find that it is peaceful where you are? And this is an approach we have been using also, for example, in working with youth in Kenya. And we are adapting a lot, and I think that's also kind of with participatory methods, and what has been preferred by youth in Kenya may not be the same in how youth in Sweden wants it. And I think also the last year, of course, it's kind of adapting to COVID restrictions as well, which is something that we have to do a lot. But maybe in general, I think in Sweden, we often talk about that we've been having peace for more than 200 years. So starting to work with peace building in Sweden, I think we really have to start with unpacking the concept of positive peace a bit more as we are working on these issues. How can we understand peace in Sweden? And what does peace mean to you? And is Sweden peaceful, just and inclusive for everyone at all places all the time? And these are some of the questions that we are talking to people about, and that we are also looking a bit more into a forthcoming publication that we are doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. A final question before I then also bring Ibertal and his perspective into the conversation. For me would be, so what are you learning from working in your own home that is different from working somewhere else, working using your own language? I sometimes find, I mean, I'm originally Austrian German. I work in English most of the time. I have trouble talking to my family about what I do. So I'd imagine just the transposition of that into your own language or into a different language is an interesting experience, which makes you think about what it does to work with most people abroad in English. So is there learning? Are there any lessons that you, maybe just one or two that you would like to highlight from working in your own home as opposed to working somewhere else?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And learning is very much at the core of the LPI approach. So there's a lot of the learning, and yes, I echo on the language. I think we've been kind of starting to learn how to speak and write in Swedish, because we're so used to doing it in English. So that's actually been an adaptation for us. And I think one thing is also kind of really, I mean, starting with the understanding and analyzing of the context. I mean, we do know this is peace builders because this is the first thing you do in peace building. You need to understand the context, but I still think it's taken maybe longer time that we anticipated when we started, that we really need to understand what kind of the situation in Sweden. And of course, this is an ongoing context analysis. And I think we're learning very much also about building alliances and working with like-minded organizations here in Sweden, such as, for example, Fryshuset, working with youth, and Operation 1325, because it's really key also, especially as this is working with peace building is new. It's good to find our allies here. And maybe some challenges, if I have time for that, Beatrix. I think one challenge is finding funding for this work. For us, it's new streams of funding, as we've been working mainly in the Horn of Africa, and also finding funding that is more long-term and not this kind of the typical yearly project frame, as we know that peace building, it's not a quick fix. Also from our work in the Horn of Africa, I think we have not needed so much visibility for LPI as an organization, as it's very much our partners and the communities that are in focus. But starting in this new context, we found it quite challenging when no one hardly knows who we are, and if they do know, it's for our work in the Horn. So I think this is something that we have discovered that we really need to work on, and kind of having to work more with social media and kind of building up our reputation and visibility in Sweden. And maybe one final thing, I think we're really also learning from how we can make connections with our programs in the Horn of Africa. And for example, this spring we have been launching a series of virtual conversations between 8 young people from Kenya and Sweden, coming from areas sometimes labeled as unsafe or insecure, often by those who live outside these areas. And from their discussions, it's been really interesting to see how many commonalities they are experiencing in their aspirations, and on how they are defining peace in their own spaces. So I stop there to let the others in.
Thanks, Jenny. That's also so many rich sort of traces that we could, and threads that we want to spin further. But I want to turn to you, Ibertal. Jenny let on that you and LPI have worked together in the past. You are program manager at the Peace and Development Center, PDC, in Ethiopia. You've been working in and on your own context for years, through your work with the Sustained Dialogue Project in Ethiopia. And I want to ask you, what lessons from working in your own context you would like to share that Western peace builders could benefit from? What can you share about what it's like to work in a country where you are, that you are part and parcel from? What kind of lessons would you share with peace builders in the North who are turning to their own at homes?
Thank you, Beatrice, for the question. Yes, for the past 5 years, I have been working with the Peace and Development Center, a local NGO that works on promoting peace and resolving conflicts in Ethiopia. We have been partnering with the LPI in different programs, including the Sustained Dialogue Program, which has been running in Ethiopian public universities for the past 10 years. I was part of the program when I was a student, as a participant of the dialogue process, and later as a program facilitator in the public universities. In my experience in this dialogue process, I have the opportunity to work with thousands of young Ethiopians, mainly in the university settings, and we have been actually performing a lot of peace building initiatives, the Sustained Dialogue being one of the major initiatives that we have been doing. In the process, I have learned that the most important thing to understand as a peace builder is what works well in home and why it works. So basically, in Ethiopia, we have been facing with identity-based conflicts in the universities and in the public, and the Sustained Dialogue Program has been one of the best tools to actually bring people together from diverse backgrounds and to promote diversity, tolerance, and social cohesion in and outside the campuses. So the lessons that I would like to share with the audience from working from the Global South is it's important to identify pressing issues or setting priorities in a participatory manner. When we design any project or any peace building initiative, it's very important to actually involve with the participants or with the target groups to identify what are the pressing issues that they want to be addressed. And this has to be done from the very beginning until the end of any program. I'm saying this because there could be many pressing issues that warrants or that requires interventions, and maybe sometimes that attracts donors. But the communities or the nations that are targets should be at the forefront in designing and implementing the program initiatives in collaborative manner. So that will also bring me to my second lesson, that is the need for joint ownership of peace building programs. Without having a sense of ownership for the program, for any program, the communities may not be really happy with the intervention that we will be bringing to their localities. So having a sense of ownership will help the communities to even sustain those initiatives even after the program schedule. The reason the Sustained Dialogue Program in Ethiopia is successful is because it has been owned especially by the universities and the students who leads the program, who designs the program, and who actually sets the topics for the dialogue. So ownership of the program by the communities is very important, and that should be always maintained. In our work, the major focus is always understanding the existing local peace structures, peace actors. So the other lesson that I would like to share is like we need to work with local peace actors and local structures. For us, for example, in the universities, we identify the peace clubs. We establish them, we strengthen them, and we revitalize the existing peace structures that can be, capacitated and also serve as peace agents in the campus. Even for community peace building initiatives, the focus is always on establishing local peace initiatives. We call them Kabale peace actor, peace committees, and the elders and the religious leaders. They play pivotal roles in sustaining, in building, sustaining peace and resolving conflicts in local communities. So, and understanding the existing local peace actors, peace initiatives, structures should be also there. One of the key criteria for any peace building initiative, and that has to be maintained throughout the time. Working with the youth, for us is like the primary, youth are our primary allies. Me, myself being a youth, it has been really a transformative endeavor for me to actually be part of the dialogue myself, and later as a facilitator of dialogue for the youth in Ethiopia and in the Horn of Africa. So identifying youth as key allies, not just as troublemakers, and giving them the power, the leadership is also one of the key recommendations that I would suggest. Thank you.
Ibetel, thank you very much. I would also be curious to learn what it was like for you to observe or support Life and Peace Institute in doing their own work in Sweden, because I understood, and I hope I did sort of read that right, that LPI actually did not just design a program in Sweden, but that you actually also brought some of your experienced peace builders from abroad to advise you in how to do this, to really apply lessons from how have we worked elsewhere, what would young people from Ethiopia, from somewhere else in the Horn of Africa, advise us to do in Sweden if they saw or if they worked through the conflict analysis. So I think one really powerful aspect of opening this conversation is also that we become learners and we may become recipients of advice and recommendations and peace building by others, as we have not been before, possibly. So as you have observed or supported LPI's work in Sweden, could you reflect a bit on what that was like for you?
Thank you, Beatrice. So LPI has been playing a pivotal role in designing and implementing peace building programs in the Horn of Africa. And its work has actually benefited thousands of young men and women in the Horn. Fortunately, I was one of the beneficiaries of the LPI's works. When I was a student at Addis Ababa University, I had the opportunity to participate in the sustained dialogue, which was supported by LPI. And in 2018, I had the opportunity to visit Sweden. I went there for a professional training in Uppsala University, and I was exposed to the existing socio-political issues in Sweden. I had a conversation with colleagues and also other trainees. Basically, my thought about Sweden before that was, it's the most peaceful nation with no apparent conflicts in outside. So that was my initial thoughts. But my visit and my conversation with people in Sweden showed me that there are of course obvious issues that should be addressed, and that requires interventions. So the Sustained Dialogue Program, having worked with it and having went through the process, I have witnessed firsthand how transformative it is for people with diverse identities and with diverse views, how it transforms relationships and how it builds trust and understanding among people. So after noticing the existing tensions among immigrants and also the leftist and liberal political groups in Sweden, I thought that the sustained dialogue could be actually be useful in terms of bringing these diverse people in terms of identity, political views together and like transform their relationships, like having empowering them to come together and address issues even before they become violent. So for me, it was really the focus of my advice for colleagues at LPI was how to approach the young people. What interests them? Like, how do we actually mobilize people, especially the young people, to come to this kind of dialogues, which traditionally are not supposed to be youth issues. But so my experience in the sustained dialogue showed me that, in fact, the young people are not always about sport. It's not about always leisure. Young people they prefer to actually have a discussion, a dialogue about real socio-political issues. That was my experience as a sustained dialogue participant, and the focus was how to actually approach the young people and how to bring them for sustained dialogue, and how to constructively contribute for the greater peace and stability in the nation.
Thank you very much. Now, in the interest of at least having a little bit of time with you in the audience, and do feel free to already start posing some questions in the chat. Also know something that I forgot earlier, to say that we will, towards the end of the session, open a document, a Google form, where you're invited to leave ideas to work further, questions that this session has raised for you, where you can leave contact details if you would like to continue this conversation or this thinking through. Before we open for that, though, I want to bring the circle around to Daniil. Daniil Davis, you are a field advisor at the National Network for Safe Communities in the US. I would like to also ask you as well have been working in a Western society on peace at home, in a society that for many years was heralded as the peace building actor, or the bringer of peace in many ways, in a society though that faces internal big divisions, big issues of exclusion and exclusion. Could you share with us some lessons of what it is like for you, what motivates you, what it looks like for you to work in a context that you are at home in, and where you try to contribute to building peace?
Great, thank you so much, Bea. And when I think of peace building, and when I think of how this work unfolds in global context, and then certainly in my home country, I think of peace building as violence prevention. And the peace building work that at least in one dimension, right? So the peace building work that I do is through police community reconciliation here in the United States. And how that sort of emerged at my organization was our executive director, David Kennedy, had done a number of violence intervention programs and believed that it was essential, as Ibotal was sharing, that to have community ownership of these efforts. So it's a deliberate partnership between police and communities that understandably hit a wall because people did not feel comfortable engaging in dialogue with law enforcement, considering the history of law enforcement in this country. Right. So I think the Black Lives Matter movement has really brought to the forefront a lot of the present harms, but these extend back to, for centuries. Police departments emerged actually out of enforcing fugitive slave laws, and since then have continued to both perpetrate forms of violence within the legal structure that was allowed, and then also sometimes outside of that, right? So this context was really important, and in trying to make these violence interventions successful, recognize the need to address another form of violence, which is institutional violence. And that's why when I think of peace building, our work emerged from that interpersonal side of things, what we think of like street violence and intimate partner violence, but really it's that institutional element that must be addressed if there's any hope of these services and programs and communities being able to work together. So through that work, I think one thing that I do want to note that is relevant to the police community reconciliation work I do here and potentially to other contexts as well, is that there's an express intent to legitimize the institution. Right, so there are some transitional justice efforts that do not have that express intent, right? They're simply doing fact-finding, uncovering different harms. But here, the goal really is to see legitimacy itself as a form of violence prevention. So legitimacy of institution of policing, and then what that represents for the state, right? So there's a lot of literature going back, US scholars to the 80s, really just showing that how the public perceives the legitimacy of police and of criminal justice institutions and of the state more broadly directly correlates to the levels of violence. So low levels of legitimacy, high levels of violence. But beyond that, another scholar, Monica Bell's done some great work on this, is the concept of legal estrangement, that for many of the most vulnerable communities experiencing the highest levels of violence, it's not a matter of having one negative interaction that disillusions them with policing. It's the fact that they've never been connected to those systems. Those systems have always only been tools of oppression and tools of violence, and never seen as reasonable recourse for them. And I can give an example, because speaking to what it means to be home, I remember when I lived in Chicago, this was before I started with the national network, and when I was living in Chicago, I was mugged. And I remember the community sort of rallied around, and they, got the assailant away, made sure that I still had all my things. They checked on me, and they asked me, do you want to call the police? I don't know how much any of you know about the South Side of Chicago, maybe from from music or something, but it was not the kind of area where I thought it would be helpful to call the police, because I felt that the people who had extended their help to me were simply just themselves going to be harassed. And it was in recognizing this sort of chasm, really, between people who need protective services the most and these institutions that purport to serve and protect, that I really wanted to enter this space and to do this work and to take what I'd been doing in Chicago and management consulting to this different context of addressing interpersonal and institutional violence. So that's one sort of nuance with the US. I think another is that when we talk about police community reconciliation, in any sort of peace building, it's important to clearly define, I think, the scope of harm that we're reviewing, right? So when we talk about police communities, policing is about more than just a given police department, right? A given chief of police in any jurisdiction is hired by a mayor, right? And there are state laws that govern different crimes, and there are federal statutes, right? So there are many systems that overlap and intertwine to reinforce oppression of various communities. So there's a challenge that I've often faced, right? We're talking with law enforcement. They're like, well, why are we getting all the blame? We didn't set the rules, right? And there's a bit of truth to that. Also, sometimes a bit of dodging, right? And passing the buck. But it is an important thing to consider that when we talk about who is responsible for peace building, who is responsible for addressing harm, are we actually engaging all of the actors who play a role in that harm? And if not, are we reasonably setting expectations about the scope of violence that we hope to address? And then I think last sort of nuance that I think is very much relevant for Western context overall, not just the United States, is the time period of the harms that we're discussing and how to delimit that in a meaningful way. Generally, with truth and reconciliation commissions, they're exploring sort of finite periods and concrete examples of harm. They're imagined in so-called post-conflict societies, right? Where, in Argentina, the forced disappearances, South Africa, apartheid, things that are considered to be over, right? So, but what does it mean when these harms are very much present and ongoing? And Michelle, I think that's just such a great job at the beginning, outlining the skepticism that a lot of places in the global north have towards the need of peace building. And that really comes to our detriment because it allows us to continue perpetrating that institutional violence against communities because we refuse to acknowledge it as such. All right, so that's the challenge that I face very much in the United States. I think, you cannot say in Germany that the Holocaust didn't happen, right? You cannot be in South Africa and not acknowledge the fact that, apartheid was unacceptable and we are moving on from that. But not acknowledging, I think, the truth of what has happened really has worked to our detriment in the United States. Where I grew up in the States is there are different, even the Civil War, people refer to it differently. They'll call it the War of Northern Aggression, right? They just reframe what it was about. And they'll say, oh, it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Okay, well, states' right to what, So I think that being really honest is critical, and it's something that can be very frustrating, especially being from communities that have been marginalized in the States. As a Black woman here, it is very frustrating to know the truth of what has happened historically, to live these experiences, and to have them continually denied.
Thank you, Danielle. I was going to ask you to pinpoint 2 reflections to conclude this round. And I think one is already almost answered. I was going to ask you if you had to name sort of one thing that would be most of a hindrance, most of an obstacle to peace building in Western societies, what would that be? Now, if I listen to you, what I would interpret is that one sort of the unwillingness to engage with one's own privilege and what that has meant for patterns of inclusion and exclusion in one's own society might be one of them. And there's an interesting reflection in the chat from Jordi Villanova, who writes, there's an essential difference between the scenarios we associate with non-peace, where peace builders traditionally act, where non-peace or war has already broken out, and the Western societies, particularly Western Europe, where violence is temporary and where peace building is preventive. Mm-hmm. How much non-peace we have described here, including the case of the US, is due to lack of awareness of the risks of local, regional, and national authorities. And I find that resonates with it in 2 different ways. So if you want to pick that up in your final reflection, for which, Danielle, I would like to also refer back to Michelle one more time, who stressed the importance of being local, also in being local as to where you are at home, and stressing how important it is to actually take your compass from communities that you take the time to listen to and to understand. In another conversation that we've had, you had referred to your work as hyper-localized. Could you also shed a bit of light on what you mean by that, and then how important it is to actually connect the local with the national or with the international in your work, in your peace building work?
Absolutely. The United States is a very large and heterogeneous country, and it's not the only one, of course, but there are some unique challenges that a country like that is going to face in terms of doing work at a national scale. So that is one. Also, but even well before the United States was 330 million and God knows how many square miles, it was deliberately designed to be a sort of federation of states, actually. And each state was designed in the Constitution to operate, for the most part, autonomously. The federal government power has increased, certainly, over the past few decades, but that was not necessarily the intent. And the space that I work in public safety is very much in the sphere of the states, right? So on shows and in Hollywood, you might see things like the FBI helping. It's not a very common experience. By and large, when people have interactions with the state, with state authorities, with state peacekeeping forces, so to speak, it's their local police department or the highway patrol or something like that. So when we say localized, we have thousands of these different agencies across the country, and they all operate differently. They're all operating under different laws. They're all serving communities that see themselves very, very differently. And I think it's really essential to recognize that in considering what sort of opportunities we have at a national scale. And Representative Barbara Lee has really been pushing for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the United States, which is incredibly exciting. And I think for some of us, certainly for me, almost hard to imagine truly materializing, right? Because then there's a question of which harms. Are we talking about the harms to Indigenous communities who we forced out into reservations and denied them the right to speak their own language and don't investigate their sexual assaults? Are we talking about the harms of bringing enslaved Africans to this country and continuing to marginalize them through these systems of power over time? We're talking about harm to immigrants, especially from Latin America. Like, there are so many different harms here, especially we are such, a large and diverse country, and people culturally identify, I think globally, in a global context, they'll identify as American, but within the country, people identify very differently. And so how somebody in Kenosha, Wisconsin might define America is very different from how somebody who's lived in Manhattan for 20 years is going to identify with America, right? So there are these different imaginations of Americana often conflict, right? And there's very much a sort of myth of America based on our creation story, right? We're built on these ideals of liberty and of justice for all and fighting against these colonizing and oppressive powers. Meanwhile, relegating enslaved Africans to be considered 3/5 of a person, not acknowledging any rights of women. So there's that tension, right, between what America, for many people, what they want it to be, right? Like my parents as immigrants from the Caribbean, it's a land of opportunity. But for other people who look just like me, but their roots are here, has been very much a land of oppression. So reconciling these different understandings of America, especially considering the vastness and diversity, is a challenge, right? And I think that the work that I do, again, by the nature of public safety, is so local because that's just how the laws are designed. But I think we, as a country, do need to reckon with these different understandings if we hope to do more work at a larger scale. And just to touch on some of what Ebiltal had shared, it's essential that we work with those local communities to empower them. Oftentimes, globally, we have this sort of colonialist and paternalistic mindset and imposing our values and our structures on other people, which I think is very harmful. But domestically, we often do the same too, especially to cultures and communities that are marginalized. So truly listening, as Jenny was saying, to these communities and engaging them as partners is practically important because we're using their expertise to actually address their local context. And it's morally imperative because we're correcting the very power imbalance that put us where we are today.
I'd like to take an in-between step against the canvas of what we've talked about in this round, in this conversation. We have another Mentimeter prepared for you. And in that, we would like to ask you who've been listening in and reflecting on your own settings, what issues would you say warrant most attention in Western Europe countries from a peace-building perspective? Again, you can just follow the link. It takes you to the little form where you can enter up to 3 suggestions. And our tech wizards in the background are going to give you a few minutes so that you're not too influenced by what other people might be writing, and then bring it back. We'll just let that sit with us as a mental image of where you feel most attention needs to go. We've got a few questions that I would then also like to bring in. We'll just give the Mentimeter a moment to work its magic. So you see various different ones. Polarization being very high up here, even though it's not a ranking. It's simply how they come up. Arms trade, exclusion, gender-based violence. We'll just let those flow by. A great many, some also referring to a fragmentation of Europe, citing Brexit, citing an undermining of values. To me, that goes back to an imagination or a creation of a shared imagination that's really important in peace building. Quite a few that say immigration, which I think is something that would also warrant unpacking, because I think it's important to also sort of be clear on what about immigration it is and why we would slot that in like that. So these just a few impressions after the end of the discussion. I'd like to bring us back to the questions. And Jenny referred directly to your work in Sweden. And I'd like to ask Rachel if maybe she would want to actually bring her question in, because I think it stands nicely for the other questions that ask a little bit, how do you position yourselves? Do you reveal that you're a peace building organization, or do you not talk about that so much? Rachel, would you care to speak out your questions so that it's not just me speaking here and the panelists, but we get an impression of who you are, who are discussing this with us?
Sure, I'm happy to, and thank you very much for the opportunity of this panel as well. It's a topic that I have long been reflecting on, and I suppose my question comes from my own sense of challenge in a way when I think about trying to apply what I do. I work mostly in the South Caucasus and have done for a long time, and one of the things I think that allows us to do what we do in the South Caucasus is that we come in from outside. We build, I hope, very kind of close partnerships, and we work very much in a sort of insider-outsider way. But we're not part of the problems in the South Caucasus. And when I think about post-Brexit Britain, and again, it raises questions about what you mean about peace or non-peace, I suppose. We don't have violence in all regions, but these really deep divisions and this inability to listen and really hear the other. I mean, within my own family, you know, there isn't a safe space to have the kind of conversation that I would like to have. And so it begs the question to me for you as a peace building organization working at home, how do you manage your relationship to the issues that you're working on, and indeed the way that you're perceived in relation to them? Are you explicit in stating where you stand? Are you able to convene the kind of spaces that you think are needed? And I was really intrigued by this this question of how much you work with partners from elsewhere who are able to come in and to reflect back things that you perhaps can't see from within your own space. So just a bit more about the actual stuff of how you do it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. A lot of interesting question. And I think, yeah, I mean, this kind of coming to the inside context, I think it's different. Yeah, when I've been kind of working with other contexts where, I mean, it's so clear I'm from the outside. So here, I think, in a way, it's almost that I feel I need to know even more, kind of, to really understand all sides, because I know I'm somehow partial to the conflicts, and I'm coming from mine, kind of how I'm brought up in the parts of Sweden that I come from. So I think, that we are where we are trying to listen in very much to other organizations and young people who are also very connected to kind of the ground, and kind of as we are doing also in the other programs, but just kind of that we need to work together with others, and kind of, I'm not an expertise in myself, so this kind of working together is important. And yeah, in kind of bringing in, I think we have been kind of using some of our colleagues from the other countries as kind of a sounding board, and coming with suggestions. And we have also, when you could travel, we had some Kenyan youth coming in as resource persons to kind of a peace lab we were doing with Swedish youth, and it was so amazing how they were learning from both sides from doing that. And now we are still kind of in the start of working with sustained dialogue, but of course my dream would be to have Gibraltar coming to help to facilitate sustained dialogue session also in Sweden, and working with language, of course. And there was something also about the kind of how explicit and kind of saying it as peace building. I think we are still describing us as a peace building organization, and I think it's kind of working with unpacking and talking about positive peace. But we are experimenting a bit with it. I mean, sometimes we've kind of been kind of unpacking it a bit, also kind of understanding peace. How we can think about peace in Sweden, kind of working kind of as trust, inclusion, and safety, and how do you talk about these? And sometimes then it gets easier. But I think we're experimenting a bit with that at the moment. Yes.
Thanks, Jenny. We're painfully quickly running short of time, so I want to draw your attention to one post that we've just put online. There is, as a follow-on path from this conversation, a Google form. This document is staying open also after this session closes. And we're inviting you to just share some of your ideas, some of the things that resonate with you after this session with us. And we're also inviting you to continue to think together and to exchange together. So please make sure that if you do want to use that, you just copy out that link now so that you have it when this session and this chat closes. Then you can take a bit of time, you can ponder, you can put something in right away, but you could also still use it in a couple of hours or a couple of days, if I understand that correctly. Michelle, just give me a nod that is so. Yes, and here it comes again. So click on that link before the session closes so that you have access to that document. One interesting question that I would still like to just bring up before we have to wrap up for today is that question of how does the peace building coming home, what kind of effect might that have on work that is building peace at home already going on, but that is called by a different name? Like some people here have referred to social cohesion work or to community work. I've had colleagues in the US who have done amazing work on gang violence or with youth. It's not necessarily labeled peace building, but it might strive for the same things. And the question is, how can peace building organizations such as ours, or peace builders, when they come back home, connect up to that work? Are there any platforms? Is there any exchange already going on? So I think with that question to the panelists, but also anybody else in the audience who might be aware of something like that, I would like to make that our last question here while we're together, before then handing over to Michelle to have a quick comment to round us out. So anybody want to pick up that idea of social cohesion, peace building work, peace building that is going on under many different names? Daniel, I saw that you had the frame up.
Yeah, so this comes up so much in the violence prevention work that I do, whether it's gang violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and reconciliation. Oftentimes we hear resistance to the word reconciliation. They're like, what are we reconciling to? These systems never served us. So listening to those communities and listening to how people define themselves is incredibly important to ensure that local ownership that we talked about being a practical necessity, but also a form of justice. Right. So in the space of gender-based violence, we often tell officers when you take down a police report, use the survivor's own words, right? Because how they define themselves, how they define what happened to them is essential to recognizing their humanity. So we don't need to be stuck on the terminology. If people want to call it, there's so many different names for this work, whatever people want to call it, however they define themselves, we owe it to them to listen, right? And to listen to their goals and to lend our expertise insofar as how it can be helpful for them achieving those goals.
Michelle?
I just had a brief comment. I think the point raised by Catherine and Stuart from International Alert are very important in terms of how do we make sure that if peace builders start engaging more at home in Western Europe, that they don't displace or absorb funding that would otherwise go to initiatives that are already happening. And I think that that is a very important point. And I don't claim to have an answer to that question. What I do want to point out, however, is that for me, there's a limitation with the frame of social cohesion in this context. And that is because social cohesion is so much focusing attention on horizontal relations between people, between communities and groups, which kind of ignores the extent to which the state, whether national authorities, regional authorities, or local authorities, might actually play into relationships between communities, a bit like Britain kind of framed the Northern Ireland conflict as a conflict between two tribes, conveniently forgetting that in fact, the way it was positioning itself and kind of facilitating access or denying access to power and services and resources was an integral part of how community relations in Northern Ireland played itself out. So I think social cohesion is important, but it's not sufficient. There is a huge element of the social contract that needs to be considered in this context. And I think that that is also where Jordi Villanova highlighted the notion of non-peace in the European context. I think we tend to very much focus still on peace and violence in terms of physical violence. And I think it is important to start paying more attention around structural violence also in our own societies. If I look at the Netherlands, when I look at my government, it's white, and it has been white for generations. When I look at parliament, it's only slowly starting to change. Only a few years ago, my prime minister still kind of claimed that he couldn't find good female politician candidates to take into his cabinet. These are issues that I think need to be subject to discussion. What are the kinds of society we want to create? If we're serious about European values and solidarity, what does it mean within our own societies, but also to the world we live in? So I recognize that we're starting to come to the end of this conversation. There are lots of really useful questions that have been raised, and I will be saving the chat because I'll hope to pick up this conversation with many of you. And so glad to see so many of you here.
I will simply second what Michelle said. The time has, as always, been too short. There are several ways in which we can continue this discussion and in which we want to continue the discussion. Jenny pointed out that there is a forthcoming LPI publication that also reflects on these issues and that tries to really also turn an eye to how do we learn to do these things. There's an interesting, the last question that is now posted in the chat is on what kind of discussions, what do we need to discuss to further this in peace building organizations? And I think that's a really useful way forward. So what do we need to confront as well ourselves in terms of our blind spots, so the things that we don't want to look at in terms of privilege and the violence that we benefit from, that might not be overt but structural. So I think there's lots of food for thought there. At the Berghof Foundation, together with Michelle, we're working on one of our next dialogue issues. Those are written exchanges around tricky subjects that we don't have ready and cut out answers for. And this challenge and this necessity of doing peace building at home is going to be at the center stage of one of them, where Michelle sort of sets the stage for us, but will invite reflections from very different perspectives on how have people done it? What do people think from different corners of the world, from different disciplines, from different areas where peace building is happening? So both keep watching that space, and if you're interested to contribute to that, reach out to us. It's an open exchange that we would love to continue having. Finally, the Google Forum remains open for you to also leave your ideas. It's also there for you to leave your contact details if you would like to enter this discussion with us in a more sustained matter. We'd love to hear from you. For today, I want to say a big thank you to my round table here surrounding me, for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, for pushing this boundary together. And to all of you who joined us here, I'm sorry that I didn't get to do more justice to all of your questions, but we have them, we save them, and be persistent and pick us up on it through the Google Forms. Have a good afternoon, have a wonderful rest of the Stockholm Peace and Development Forum, and may our paths cross again soon.